Emma burst into the party in a furious rage, her face red with anger. "How dare you do that?" she roared, her voice sharp as a knife. Before anyone could react, she swung her arm violently, sending the table laden with food flying into the air. Plates, cups, and food shattered, falling to the floor, mingling with her wild screams. The Jackson family, who were sitting around the table, were startled and looked at each other in shock. The joyful atmosphere of the party was suddenly ripped apart. No one understood what was happening. Just as Emma had knocked over the table, 2 police officers following her also stormed into the yard. They stood silently, not saying a word, but their eyes were all on the Jackson family, as if ready for a confrontation. One officer looked back and forth, then continued to stand silently, not intervening. "Listen up," Emma yelled, her voice echoing throughout the garden. "They stole and ate my dog. This morning I saw the children from this house playing with the dog on the porch. Where is it now?" The Jackson family stood stunned, unable to believe Emma's words. The little child looked at her mother, her innocent eyes not understanding why the party was so abruptly interrupted. Samuel, the father, tried to stay calm, but the tension inside him could not be hidden. "Sister Emma, you've misunderstood. We just let the dog play with the children for a bit. No one had any intention of doing anything to it," Samuel said, his voice low and patient. But Emma wouldn't listen. She glared at Samuel and continued to scream. "You think I'll believe these lies? I saw everything. You ate it, and I won't let this go." She turned to the 2 police officers, her eyes pleading. But instead of intervening, the 2 officers just stood silently, taking no action. One officer glanced at Samuel as if to give a warning look. The entire Jackson family stood there, helpless, unable to say a word. They felt surrounded, not only by Emma's anger, but also by the silence of the law enforcers, who were supposed to protect justice. "You will pay for this," Emma continued to yell, her voice tearing through the air. "I won't forgive this." Emma suddenly pointed a finger at the dining table, where plates of lamb were just laid out. "Here, this is the clearest evidence. The meat you have on the table is my dog's meat," she shrieked, her eyes full of contempt and hatred. "I can't believe it. You dare to do that at your own party?" The eyes of the Jackson family, who were standing nearby, turned from astonishment to shock. Samuel quickly turned to look at the plates of meat on the table. Although it was lamb for a moment, he couldn't help but feel dizzy at being so brazenly accused. "Sister Emma, we didn't do anything wrong. That's just lamb." Samuel tried to stay calm, but Emma's words were like a dagger stabbing into his mind. Every word she said was an unbearable insult. Emma wouldn't listen to any explanation. She continued to point at the plates of lamb on the table, her voice fiery. "Lamb, you think I'll believe that story? You killed my dog and now you have the audacity to eat it as if nothing happened." The air around them was now thick with hatred and fear. Everyone in the Jackson family felt trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The children looked at their parents, their eyes filled with worry. They didn't understand why their happy party had been so torn apart, all because of a misunderstanding they couldn't explain. The second police officer's eyes did not leave the Jackson family. Although he said nothing, they clearly felt his agreement with Emma. Those looks only made the situation more tense, as if the Jackson family was standing before an insurmountable wall. Emma stood there, still pointing at the plates of lamb on the table, her eyes full of indignation. "You can't fool me. I know exactly what you did. I won't let this go." Her voice was like a heavy blow to the silent garden, and the tension began to spread everywhere. Samuel Jackson felt his throat tighten, the explanation stuck in his heart. He looked at his wife, his eyes full of helplessness. He knew that no matter what he said, Emma would not listen, and the cold stares from the 2 police officers only made everything worse. Suddenly, one of the officers stepped toward Samuel, his eyes serious but not entirely without attention. "Mr. Jackson," the officer said, his voice low and firm, "we need to clarify the situation regarding the disappearance of the dog, as well as the plates of meat on the table." Samuel looked at the officer, surprised but also feeling a bit of hope, even though he knew it might not change anything. "We had no intention of harming Mrs. Emma's dog," he replied, his voice full of concern. "Her dog played with the children for a while, and then it went back to her house. There's nothing more than a misunderstanding." The officer raised his eyebrows, clearly not entirely convinced. I understand, he said, bending down to look at the plate of meat on the table. But what I see here are plates of meat, and Mrs. Emma claims they are her dog's meat. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling a storm of tension building inside him. It's lamb, he said, his voice firm but still with a hint of worry. It's not dog meat. We bought this meat from the market. Mrs. Emma might have been mistaken, and perhaps... He stopped, feeling that these words were not convincing enough. The officer said nothing more, but just nodded and looked at Emma. We'll need some time to check this again, but I advise you to stay calm and avoid making the situation more tense. He turned to look at the Jackson family, his eyes both cold and urgent. Emma would not let it go. You can't let them get away. This is a dog-eating case. Are you going to let me endure this suffering? But the officer just turned his back, stepped closer to Emma, and said softly but firmly, Mrs. Emma, we will handle the matter according to the law. Please don't make a scene anymore. The tension did not decrease, but at least the officer had asked Emma to calm down. However, Samuel could not stop thinking about what had just happened. A sense of powerlessness welled up inside him, and even though he could prove his innocence, he still felt the burden of society's prejudiced gaze on his shoulders. The Jackson family stood in silence, the children not understanding why their party had turned into such a tense event. The atmosphere in the garden was now heavy and suffocating. They not only had to face baseless accusations, but also the silence of those who were supposed to protect them. The officer still stood there, his eyes serious as he looked at Samuel. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice firm but not lacking in politeness. Mr. Jackson, please wait a moment, the officer said. We need to call a specialist to verify whether this is indeed dog meat. We cannot ignore this request from Mrs. Emma. Just to be sure everything is correct, we need to work carefully. Samuel felt as if a heavy stone was pressing on his chest. While he understood that the officer was just doing his job, these words only added to his pain. His family was already tired of the baseless judgments, and now they had to face an unfounded investigation. Specialist? Samuel asked, his voice trying to stay calm, but his eyes clearly reflecting the tension. What about us? Don't we have the right to explain? Is this all just because of Mrs. Emma's accusations? The officer did not reply immediately, just nodded and continued to speak. Yes, Mr. Jackson. We need to ensure that everything is thoroughly checked. In addition, I also need you to provide more information. We will need to investigate further whether you or anyone in the family was involved in the theft of Mrs. Emma's dog. The officer's words were like a slap to Samuel's face. The feeling of being slandered welled up inside him again. I've made it clear. We didn't do anything wrong, he replied, his voice choked. That dog just played with the children for a few minutes, and then it went back on its own. If Mrs. Emma thinks it disappeared because of me, then she has to prove it, not me. The officer did not seem to intend to immediately refute him. He looked towards Emma, who was now standing in a corner, her arms crossed, her face still red with anger. I understand, Mr. Jackson, the officer said, but I am only working according to Mrs. Emma's request and the procedure. I need to verify all information before I can proceed to the next step. Samuel stood in silence, his heart feeling constricted. He turned to look at his wife, her eyes reflecting the pain, speechless. The atmosphere in the garden was now suffocating, as if an invisible wall was weighing down on everyone. Everything had changed too quickly, from a happy party to an unwanted confrontation. Emma stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes still on the Jackson family. It seemed she felt she was winning, as if she had achieved what she wanted. Once again, she pointed at the plates of lamb, her eyes lighting up as if she had just discovered undeniable evidence. You won't get away with this, she said, her voice full of satisfaction. I won't let this go. I will make you pay. Emma would not let go, continuing to harass and shout as if the authorities were on her side. Everyone in the Jackson family felt a profound numbness inside. It was because of prejudice and discrimination that they had to endure these terrible days. The officer turned back to Samuel, his eyes a little softer. Mr. Jackson, please understand that this is the procedure. We don't mean to imply you did anything wrong, but we need to have all the information before we can make a final decision. Samuel sighed, no longer having the strength to argue. I understand, he replied, although his heart was still filled with frustration. So what do I have to do? The officer held out his hand as if to reassure him. Please wait for a while. We will call the specialist and work with you when we have the results. But please don't leave. I need your contact information for when it's necessary. The officer stood for a long time, silently observing the Jackson family, his eyes not leaving Samuel. Samuel felt the tension engulfing the entire space. The anger from Emma, the silence of the officers, and their cold stares seemed to be surrounding him. In that moment, he felt like an accused person without a chance to defend himself. We will call the specialist right away, Mr. Jackson, the officer continued, breaking the prolonged silence. Please be patient. That statement did not lessen Samuel's anxiety. On the contrary, it made him feel even more drawn into a situation with no way out. So what do I need to do? He asked, his voice weary. The officer slowly flipped through his notebook, jotting down some information before continuing to speak, his eyes still on Samuel. We will need some more information, Mr. Jackson, the officer said, his voice even but still maintaining a professional attitude. Specifically about whether you or anyone in the family may have come into contact with Mrs. Emma's dog or have any relationship with its disappearance. Samuel felt anger welling up inside him, but he could not let his emotions take over now. Taking a deep breath, he replied, As I said, that dog just played with my children for a while, and then it went back to Mrs. Emma's house on its own. We didn't do anything wrong. The officer did not refute him, just made more notes in his notebook. But his gaze made Samuel feel that something was wrong. The feeling of being watched and accused still wouldn't let him go. We will investigate everything thoroughly, Mr. Jackson, the officer said, and then turned to leave, as if leaving him with questions and suspicion. Emma still stood in a corner, her eyes not leaving the Jackson family, her face full of contempt. When the officer turned, his back, she continued, I won't let you get away. I've seen what I needed to see. Don't think you can hide the truth. In your opinion, what happens next? Does Mrs. Emma realize her mistake, or was her accusation correct? Please follow the True Color Stories channel and turn on notifications to support the channel in telling meaningful stories. Samuel felt as if a heavy stone was pressing on his chest. Emma not only accused them baselessly, but also didn't give them any chance to clear their names. No matter how reasonable his explanation was, she wouldn't listen. A moment later, the officer returned, his voice as calm as ever. Mr. Jackson, the specialist will be here in about 20 minutes, he announced. Before they arrive, I need you to provide detailed information about how Mrs. Emma's dog went missing and why it appeared in your garden this morning. Samuel bowed his head, feeling like everything was collapsing around him. I already said it was a misunderstanding, he replied, his voice trying to stay steady. The children just played with it for a bit. It's a gentle dog. It always goes back to Mrs. Emma. The officer did not reply immediately. He just looked at Samuel for a while, as if evaluating his words. We will work with the meat specialist. Once we have the results, we will continue the investigation, he said, and then turned away again, without another word. Samuel felt as if he was standing in the middle of a storm. The officers silently left, leaving the Jackson family in silence, as if they had been left in a world full of suspicion and absurdity. The children looked at their parents, their eyes full of worry, not understanding why their small party had suddenly become such a tense confrontation. But Emma still wouldn't give up. She continued to stand there, her eyes not leaving the Jackson family, as if she was waiting for a signal to attack again. At this point, her outrage was not just because of the missing dog, but also because of the look she had for the Jackson family. A look that never changed, the look of a bigot. The atmosphere in the Jackson family's garden became heavy and silent. The whole family stood still, no one daring to speak. The children looked at their parents with anxious eyes, not understanding how the party had turned into such a tense confrontation. Emma still stood in the corner of the yard, her arms crossed, her eyes still on the Jackson family. Neither she nor the two officers seemed to be in a hurry. Everything seemed to stop in a suffocating moment, with only the sound of the wind blowing through the leaves and gentle sounds from the surroundings. The second officer stood silently for a while, still maintaining a serious demeanor, but his eyes seemed to be looking through the crowd, as if not really paying attention to the ongoing event. Meanwhile, the other officer, the one Samuel had spoken to earlier, was constantly making notes in his notebook, clearly still focused on his work. A moment later, the second officer, who seemed unhappy with the situation, quietly walked out of the yard, not saying anything to anyone. His eyes were pensive, as if he was thinking about everything that was happening. "She's gone too far again," the second officer said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't think they could do something like that." The other officer, who had remained silent all along, just looked at his colleague for a long time and sighed. "We have to follow the procedure. Mrs. Emma asked us to investigate, and we can't ignore it." "But this is not fair," the second officer replied, his voice full of dissatisfaction. "This family didn't do anything wrong. They are just victims of a serious misunderstanding. Our job is to investigate, not to judge," the other officer emphasized, but his face showed signs of fatigue. The second officer did not reply immediately. He just shook his head, his eyes showing hesitation. "I know, but this is clearly a problem. We can't let these people endure discrimination just because of their skin color, especially when everything is just baseless accusations." The other officer looked at him, saying nothing. A moment of silence enveloped them. The second officer continued to walk to a corner of the yard, where Samuel still stood, looking distraught. He stopped for a moment and then continued walking, trying to find some calm amidst the whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. "Mr. Jackson," the second officer spoke, his voice gentler, as if trying to soothe the tense atmosphere. "I know this is very unpleasant, and I can't say too much about the investigation results, but I want you to understand, it's not easy for us to see this matter escalate so much." Samuel looked at him, unable to hide the weariness in his eyes. "I just want my family's party not to be ruined by unfounded accusations. Mrs. Emma didn't give us a chance to explain. And you guys, you just stood there, looking at me like a criminal?" The second officer sighed, looking down at the ground as if thinking about what Samuel had just said. "I know," he said, his eyes full of sympathy, "but sometimes we have to do what we're asked to do, whether we want to or not. I just hope everything will be cleared up soon." Samuel looked at the officer with a hopeless gaze. "Hope doesn't help when you're facing racism, does it?" The second officer was silent. He didn't know how to reply. Maybe in his heart, everything was already too clear, but his duty prevented him from acting according to his conscience. Meanwhile, Emma still stood far away, her eyes as if waiting for a new opportunity to attack the Jackson family. The atmosphere became increasingly tense, and everyone in the Jackson family, from Samuel to the children, felt the suffocating feeling in their own home. One officer stood on the other side of the yard, still holding his notebook and making notes, his eyes fixed on the Jackson family. The other officer maintained a professional attitude, but these moments of silence had lasted too long, and Samuel began to feel that this confrontation was not just between Emma and his family anymore. It was a battle between justice and racism, between people in an unjust society. Emma couldn't stand the prolonged silence any longer. All the tension seemed to only make her more angry. Unable to stand still, she ran closer to the two officers, her eyes full of fire, and pointed at the Jackson family. "What are you taking so long for?" Emma yelled, her voice full of defiance and contempt. "Or were you bribed by them? Good, you want to protect these people, huh? You definitely have no intention of clearing up this matter, do you?" Both officers turned around, their eyes suddenly tense, and the second officer glanced at his colleague. Emma still wouldn't stop, stepping closer, constantly applying pressure. "That's right, you're not doing anything. How much time have you wasted, just standing there watching this family being slandered? I saw it clearly. I will sue you if you don't act immediately," Emma shouted, her voice tearing through the air in the garden. The second officer, who had already had some internal conflict, seemed to have lost his patience. He turned to look at Emma, his face having lost its composure. "Mrs. Emma, please be patient. We are following the procedure. Don't make the situation more tense." But Emma wouldn't stop. She constantly pointed her finger at the Jackson family, her face flushed with anger. "Procedure? What the hell kind of procedure is that? This is a matter of life and death. Don't you understand? They harmed my dog and you're just standing there watching?" The atmosphere grew heavier, and the Jackson family, despite trying to stay calm, couldn't help but feel helpless. Samuel tried to step towards Emma, but the first officer immediately stopped him, his voice stern. "Mr. Jackson, please don't cause more conflict. Let us handle this," the officer said, his voice tense. He was clearly uncomfortable with this situation, but was forced to stand firm in his job. But Emma, not only did she not heed the warning, but she also shouted more. "No, no, I won't let you let these people go. If you don't act immediately, I will sue you for not fulfilling your duty," she roared, her eyes shining with indignation. The second officer, looking tired and confused, turned to the other officer, his eyes full of conflict. "Maybe she's right. We can't just stand here and let her make a scene like this." The other officer sighed, his voice firmer. "We are just following the procedure. Don't let her make us lose control." Despite this, the second officer couldn't help but feel the injustice of the situation. He glanced at the Jackson family, then back at Emma, feeling confused and weary. "Mrs. Emma, please be patient a little longer. If there is no clear evidence, we cannot act hastily." Emma, unwilling to stop, continued to yell. "No clear evidence? Are you defending them?" "I saw everything, and I won't be silent anymore." The atmosphere in the garden became increasingly tense. The party guests still stood there, witnessing a scene they couldn't believe. The children looked at their parents, their eyes welling up with tears, not understanding why everything had turned so bad. Samuel looked at the second officer, his eyes full of disappointment. "We didn't do anything wrong. This whole family is just a victim in this battle." The second officer looked at him, his eyes full of conflict. He wanted to say something but couldn't. Only silence was the answer. Meanwhile, Emma still didn't stop, continuing to shout, putting pressure on the officers. Her indignation and judgmental attitude made everything worse. At this moment, Samuel felt like he was standing at a crossroads. Society and the community were pushing them into a corner, not giving them a chance to explain or clear their names. No matter how innocent they were, discrimination and prejudice always followed them, like a shadow that never leaves. Emma still stood there, her eyes shining with indignation. The more she heard the officer's explanations, the more agitated she became. "What are you doing? I've made it clear they stole my dog and ate it," she yelled, her voice shrill. "Can't you do anything?" "I don't want to stand here for another minute." The first officer, who stood near Emma, frowned and sighed. "Mrs. Emma," he said, his voice patient but still authoritative, "we understand your concern, but we must patiently wait according to the procedure. The specialist will arrive soon, and we can't do anything more until we have verified results." Emma glared at the officer, her anger not subsiding, but the officer continued to hold his ground. "If you continue to make a scene, I will have to ask you to leave. We need to work according to the procedure, and if you cannot be patient, you will have to leave." Emma took a deep breath, feeling pushed to the wall. But instead of continuing to cause trouble, she turned, pointed directly at the Jackson family, her eyes still full of indignation. "I won't let you get away with this," she roared, and then turned away, leaving the tense atmosphere in the garden. After Emma left, the second officer, who had been silent all this time, looked at his colleague for a moment and then walked towards Samuel. He paused for a bit, then stepped closer to Samuel, not saying anything at first, but just looking toward the Jackson family, his face a little pensive. "Mr. Jackson," the second officer began, his voice gentler than before, "I'm sorry about what just happened. I know this isn't fair to you." Samuel looked at the officer, clearly feeling the weariness in his eyes. This statement made him feel a little relieved, but immediately the feeling of disappointment came back. "We were just having a small party," he replied, his voice low. "We just wanted a little happiness after a long day. But now everything is torn apart by baseless accusations and your silence." The second officer felt a lump in his throat. He stood silent for a moment, his eyes looking down at the ground as if trying to find words of comfort, but not knowing what to say. Finally, he looked up, his eyes now full of conflict. "I can't stand this injustice anymore," he said, his voice soft, but with a hint of tension. I've seen many cases like this, and I know when the way others look at us isn't fair." Samuel looked at the officer, his heart seeming to break for a moment. "So what do you think?" he asked, his voice subdued. "We are black people. How do you think we should live when we're always being judged without a chance to speak?" The second officer took a deep breath. "Sometimes I feel like I can't bear it," he said, his voice a little choked. "This job makes me do things that I don't think are right. But I don't have the right to change the procedure. I can only do what I'm asked to do." Samuel was silent, not knowing what to say. The words of the second officer were like a dagger stabbing into his mind. All he and his family wanted was to live peacefully in their community, but they always had to face discrimination and baseless judgments. Inside the house, the children were sitting around the table, their eyes teary, trying to understand why their party was ruined like this. One of them, the youngest daughter, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "Dad, why does she hate us so much? I just wanted to play with the dog." Samuel looked at his daughter, his heart clenching. He bent down, hugging his child tightly. "My dear, no one has the right to hate us just because of our skin color. We didn't do anything wrong. What we do is live in peace, and we will not let anyone steal our peace." But inside him, the disappointment grew. The whole family was tired of the invisible battles, with the struggles that no one saw but were always present in their daily lives. Even though he tried to teach his children lessons about patience and love, he himself didn't know what to do when faced with an unjust society. The atmosphere in the garden was still as tense as a guitar string, everyone's eyes fixed on the second officer and Samuel. Footsteps from afar gradually became clearer, as a sign that a resolution was approaching. After a long 20-minute wait, the sound of a car broke the suffocating silence. A small truck pulled up, and a man in a professional protective suit got out. He was the forensic specialist, carrying the necessary testing tools. The second officer turned to look at Samuel, then led the specialist to the area of the disturbed party. The entire Jackson family still stood there, the tension not letting go. The specialist began his work, using equipment and tools to check the remaining plates of meat on the table, carefully collecting meat samples and conducting tests. Everyone watched in silence, while the officer and Samuel could only stand and wait for the results. Time seemed to stretch, endlessly, and the atmosphere was so heavy it could be cut with a knife. Finally, after a few tense minutes, the specialist returned with the results. He approached the two officers, his voice serious. "The test results are in, and from my check, it is not dog meat. This is lamb. There is no sign that this is meat from Mrs. Emma's dog." The words of the specialist were a shock to Emma. Her eyebrows furrowed, her indignation still not subsiding, but she couldn't refute the result. The first officer turned to look at Emma, his voice cold but also with a hint of emphasis. "Mrs. Emma, according to the forensic results, these plates of meat are not dog meat. Therefore, you will have to apologize to the Jackson family for the baseless accusations," the officer said, his eyes seeming to hope for an official apology. Emma stood stunned, her eyes full of disappointment, but she still wouldn't let go. She turned back, looking at the two officers with a look full of indignation. "Apologize? I don't think I have to apologize to anyone. My dog is missing, and I have a reason to suspect what I saw. You can't just ignore this like that." The second officer looked at Emma, his voice softer. "Mrs. Emma, we have followed the procedure, and the result is clear. But this has caused harm to the Jackson family, and an apology is necessary." Emma still wouldn't back down, shaking her head and yelling. "Maybe it's not that they ate the dog, but then where did my dog go? You've checked everything, but you still haven't found it. They hid it somewhere, I'm sure. Search their house." Emma's words once again made the atmosphere more tense. The entire Jackson family stood still, unable to believe that she still wouldn't accept the test results. The looks from Samuel's family were now not just disappointment, but shock at Emma's stubbornness. "Mrs. Emma, we have done everything according to the procedure, and the results are not suspicious," the second officer said, his voice having become weary. "But we cannot continue this investigation without clear evidence." However, Emma still wouldn't let go. "You can't ignore it. They are hiding my dog. I want you to search their house immediately," she shouted, her face flushed with anger. The first officer looked at Emma with determination, then turned to the second officer, gesturing as if to stop everything here. "We can't do anything more without valid evidence," the first officer said, his voice firm. "Mrs. Emma, I'm asking you to stop right now. If not, we will have to ask you to leave." But Emma continued to scream, "No, I won't leave until you clear this up. You let these people get away with a crime without doing anything." The situation became even more tense. The Jackson family, despite trying to stay calm, still couldn't help but feel the indignation and injustice they were facing. Samuel looked at the officers, feeling like he was being pushed into a corner with no escape. "What did we do wrong?" he asked, his voice choked. Once again, the second officer looked at Samuel, his eyes full of conflict. He felt helpless having to witness this scene, where justice was challenged just because of Emma's prejudice and stubbornness. "We will resolve this," the second officer said, but his voice no longer had the confidence it had before. "Mrs. Emma, I ask you to stop for a moment. We cannot continue without more clear evidence." The atmosphere in the garden was still thick with tension, but after a short while, another police car arrived. A new officer stepped out, carrying a file and a laptop. The second officer looked at him. It seemed he knew that the new person's intervention was necessary in this situation. "We have called for more support," the second officer said, his eyes tired but determined. "We have found a security camera near the area where the dog went missing." The new officer, without saying a word, went directly to a corner of the yard where there was a camera. He opened his laptop and quickly plugged in a cable, then entered a code to access the data from the nearby security camera. The silence was so complete that everyone could hear the steady sound of the keyboard tapping. Emma still stood there, her eyes not leaving the Jackson family, her attitude showing no sign of remorse. Just a few seconds later, the computer screen lit up, and everyone could see clearly. The image from the security camera showed Mrs. Emma's dog playing on the porch, as usual, but then it was taken away from the area by a group of white teenagers. These people seemed unfamiliar to the Jackson family, and were definitely not related to them at all. The second officer looked at the image on the screen and shook his head. "This is clear evidence," he said. "The dog was taken by this group of teenagers, and there is no connection to the Jackson family." Emma stood frozen, her anger not yet gone, but she couldn't deny the image right in front of her. The truth was undeniable, but she still tried to find a way to justify herself. The first officer looked at Emma, his eyes full of resolve. "Mrs. Emma, we are very sorry, but according to the investigation results, the Jackson family is not involved in the disappearance of the dog. It was taken by another group of teenagers." He paused for a moment and then continued, his voice no longer tense as before, but still with a hint of sternness. "We will find a way to identify this group of suspects. When we have more information, we will invite you to the station to work with us. For now, I ask you to go back and wait for the investigation results." Emma looked at the officer for a long time, her mouth opening as if to say something, but then she just stood still, her eyes suddenly becoming blank. She had no more words to justify herself, but the indignation was not yet gone. She mumbled and finally turned away with unconcealable frustration. When Emma and the two officers left, the atmosphere in the garden seemed to lighten. However, the tension still lingered in the hearts of the Jackson family. They stood there silently, while Samuel looked at his family, his eyes full of weariness. A moment later, while the youngest daughter of the Jackson family was playing nearby, she asked a question that everyone could see was a pain in her heart. "Dad, what if we were white? Would we not be treated like this?" His daughter's question made Samuel stop. He sat down next to her, a heavy feeling in his heart. He looked at his daughter, then at his wife. Although he had faced discrimination countless times, this time the feeling of oppression was particularly intense. "My dear, sometimes unfair things happen because of the color of our skin," Samuel replied, his voice low. "But this discrimination is wrong. If we were white, would they have pushed us into this situation? Maybe not." He paused for a moment, his eyes full of contemplation. "That's the question we always have to face. Why is it like this? Why are we treated this way just because of our skin color? Why do some people feel powerful just because they have a different skin color? Those questions never have a satisfying answer, but we can't stop asking them." His daughter looked at him, her innocent eyes full of confusion. "So what should we do, Dad?" Samuel hugged his child, his eyes shining with determination, despite the deep sadness inside. "We have to keep fighting, my dear. Every day, every step, we have to set an example for others to see that we deserve to live in a just society where there is no discrimination." This story is a reminder that no matter how many years pass, racism is still a difficult problem. Social prejudices still exist and affect the lives of many people, especially those in the Black community. But the important thing is that we cannot stop questioning and fighting for justice. This is a testament to the challenges that people in the Black community face. Prejudice, whether obvious or not, is always present, and we still need to continue to ask and fight, not only for ourselves, but also for future generations. The questions never end, and hope can only be ignited through the actions of each person. So if you were in that situation, how would you react? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the True Color Stories channel to follow more meaningful stories about life, about racism, and about the questions our society still has to face every day.